Good morning, everybody. And I think I'm live on audio online as well. Thank you for joining us here for talk about identity management and how that relates to open science and the challenges that we are facing as we grow and evolve our science community. My name is Ben Williams. I am the product manager for the Earth Data Cloud platform group, so infrastructure services to NASA ESDIS and their Earth Science program. I'm joined today by Nathan Clark, our train architect and solutions architect for the cloud. So I'm the one who talks a lot. He's the one who actually knows what the hell is going on. Let me get myself here into presentation mode for you. We have a relatively small crowd here in the room and online. So just to give you a sense of where we're at and what we're talking about, we have our own thoughts and challenges within the NASA ESDIS community about identity management and access to ESDIS data, but we are looking for input from the community and having a dialogue about the challenges that the community is facing and potential solutions in that area. So there's a Slido that you're welcome to link to post any questions in the Q&A section for Nathan and myself or the room in general when we get to the open discussion portion. And there'll be some targeted questions that we'll ask for you to participate in as we go. So looking at FAIR data and open science, we acknowledge that it's a continuum of relatively closed access and fully open data that honestly, anonymous access or access controls ends up being a little bit of a juxtaposition. But we wanted to talk about that space because we know we are not all the way to the right on this diagram. And so identity management and access control is a reality in our systems, both in exposing that data to the general public, as well as how that interacts with our underlying and backing infrastructure systems. So let's talk about it. Identity management and open science. Open science is all about opening up this data, free and open to the scientific community, where access management is, to a degree, the opposite, is making sure only certain people have access to the data that's at the appropriate level for their use. So we start talking about EULAs, we start talking about commercial data, we start talking about international agreements and areas where our data is not truly fully open, where anonymous access is sufficient. How do we blend these two together? What are the technology solutions that we maybe need to be considering as this grows and evolves? Is this even the right direction? It's the conversation we're hoping to have. And so with that, I want to ask Nathan to join at the podium to start talking about where things are at, where things we think are going, some of the research items that NASA ESDIS is pursuing in this area. Nathan Clark, good morning.
Can you get him the Slido link to post in chat? Online. The Slido link URL so we can post it in the Zoom chat. Hey, my name's Nathan Clark. As Ben said, I'm a system architect, also working for ESDIS with some of their cloud-hosted systems. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a slow motion explosion that we've been seeing in the identity space in the suite of services and data sets that we host, and why we feel like we need to start taking a different direction with how we handle this problem. Everything starts simple enough. You have a thing and you want users to get to the thing. Maybe that's a data set, maybe it's an application or service or API or a blog where you post pictures of your cat. Regardless, for some reason, you want to know who's using this. You might have basic access controls, restrictions, who's allowed to get to this content. You might just want to make sure people aren't filling your comment field with spam links to ransomware. Maybe you have license agreements that you actually need to make sure people have signed, or other reasons you have to know who's coming in so that you can control who gets access to what, route them through other services first or whatnot. So you have a thing, you add a way for people to log into the thing. And this is actually where pretty much everything starts. And then you have more than one thing, and these might be managed by different teams. So each of them spins up a way for you to log into that system. They might be different tools or products that only speak a certain language. You might have one service, it needs an LDAP directory to talk to, so you spin up LDAP. Another service might talk to Facebook login or something else. And you end up with a suite of services and applications and data sets that you're hosting, and a suite of identity providers that people are using to get access to those things. And that's great, except people aren't that simple. People don't just want access to one thing. They want access to several of your things. And they end up in a situation where they have to juggle credentials to n different systems to get to n different systems. And credential juggling ends up being a large part of everyone's day. And if these are software systems, then credential juggling ends up being a large part of the code you're writing in order for your code to be able to get access to all the systems it wants to talk to, because nothing is ever truly one-to-one silos, systems that only need to talk to one thing and only need to work with one identity system. And then you start adding partner organizations, other contracts, different user groups. And it starts to quickly become that kind of combinatorial explosion of every system is having to implement every different way of logging in for every different user community that might need access to it. This gets really untenable fast. You're making the identity providers on the right far more complex because every one of them has to handle every possible way that people might need to access your services. All your services have to integrate with ever more of these identity providers and handle different workflows for access, whether they're human workflows or machine-based workflows. And you end up with that kind of combinatorial explosion of the complexity on both sides of the equation of what you're implementing in order to be able to support all the different kinds of users and use cases you need to support. And you end up with a lot of really wonky workarounds in order to make this function. If you have a service that needs a particular user community to have access to it, but the user directory that user community is in doesn't support the access requirements of that service, you end up layering things like, well, you also have to be connected to this VPN to access it because the VPN has the right access restrictions, but not the right user database. Or you end up with duplicative services because you have a service that does exactly what the users need, but it has the wrong user directory. So you have to spin up a duplicate copy of the service just so that it can point at a different user directory, even though it's doing the same thing. And again, this combinatorial explosion of how many instances of everything you need and how many different workflows they each have to support is, we are at a position right now, we're at this threshold where we're seeing this explosion coming and realizing we got to stop doing this. We need this to not be the problem we're trying to solve. We need to figure out how to solve a different problem that makes this tenable, because we can't keep going this direction.
Not everybody has to be in every meeting.
Similar problem, just not everybody needs to be in every user directory or have every MFA token. And then all these systems also want to talk to each other, except at this point, they're all talking mutually unintelligible languages concerning identity. I'm Nathan Clark in the first one, I'm N Clark in the second, I'm Orange Wombat 32 in the third one, because that's Fortnite. They don't have any way of even knowing that's the same person. And if I have certain permissions in one place, that means nothing to any other system in here. And there's no real way to do things that require multiple systems or make these systems interoperate without more workarounds. If you're a person, you download data from one system and you upload it to the other so that you can work with it where you need it. If you're a software, a Python script or something, you have all this code just to juggle credentials so that you can be one identity to read data from here and be a totally different identity to write data here. And it means that this identity management problem becomes the thing everybody's having to spend all their time on instead of the thing you'd like to be working on, whether that's your cat blog or actually doing data analysis. So we're obviously coming from one very particular perspective where we're an infrastructure team that does a lot of security and infrastructure and networking work for cloud-hosted systems and applications. Our perspective here is definitely coming from that approach of how, as the platform provider, do we help support a better way of handling an identity? And one of the things we wanted to do here is discuss both what we think a possible solution to this is for what we're seeing and what we're trying to solve, but then have that kind of more open discussion of, are we even seeing the right problems? Have other people run into these same problems and actually there's a much better way to solve it than we're trying to solve it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we are hoping to solve it, what we've kind of come to and think is kind of our solution to getting out of this mess. And then with the Slido and conversation in the room, basically ask, are we right? Are we wrong? Are we totally missing some obvious holes or other tools, other solutions to this problem? So where have we gotten? Or where do we think we're going? Our overall goal, we know that there are 1,000 different identity providers out there, and that's not changing. We are never going to be in a situation where we can tell the universe, no, you should just use our thing. That's not happening. We're working with an ever-growing number of partner organizations and contracts, and they're never all going to be in the same user directory, right? Your university isn't going to switch to using our user directory because we don't run your university and we're not going to. And the technology keeps changing. New protocols, new workflows, new ways of accessing data that require identity keep getting invented, and we need to be able to keep up with that. So what we went looking for, we want a broker, a Rosetta Stone in here, something that can intermediate between all these different identity providers and all these different services that need identity, that can translate between different protocols and understand that this person who logged in with Facebook is the same as this person who logs in with your internal LDAP user directory and manage their permissions appropriately. We want users especially to be able to bring their own identity and not have to continually sign up for a new set of credentials, new identity to get access to the next service just because the next service needed to talk SAML instead of OAuth. A few more considerations that we had in here. I've gone through a few high-level ones, but there's so many things we would need a tool like this to be able to handle. Obviously, it has to be scalable. We're at the 1.5 million users right now in our Theta login, which is our primary end user-facing login system right now. It's going to be going up to 3 to 5 million in the near future. We need to be able to handle machine access. Again, this isn't just people at browsers. We need to be able to handle scripts with API tokens or certificates if these are long-lived servers that you want to install a cert on rather than just having an API key for. We've got to still be able to handle license agreements because we still have commercial and international partners that have particular requirements. There's a lot of things we need a system like this to be able to handle. So where we've been looking. One, we want to stop building our own user directories and identity management systems altogether. That's not really the space we want to be in, and we're in the space where we're constantly having to build new ones to handle new use cases, and that's just not tenable. We do have specific requirements for use cases that we can't just let you have the thing. We need to get some more information about you, especially the ability to modify data or contribute metadata. We need a little more assurance about you are the person you say you are when you're coming in than just, hey, my name's Joe. Let me do the thing. We hope to do this by our current kind of, the solution we believe is going to help with this is to adopt identity federation solutions that sit between the use case, the system or data set or service that you're providing access to and the particular identity provider to act as that broker or that Rosetta Stone. Some examples that we've been evaluating are tools like Okta and Auth0 and ForgeRock that do exactly this kind of thing, or at least claim to in the marketing material. And that's exactly what we've been spending the last 3 to 6 months investigating to see how real is this? Is this just marketing material? And do they work for the kind of use cases that we have versus being, a commercial vendor with a SaaS product out there somewhere? Finally, this all presumes from the very beginning you need to know who your user is. We are at the same time trying to figure out, are there places that we really don't need to know who the user is? Obviously, if there's license agreements, we do, access restrictions, you do, any kind of permissions that you need to manage, you need to know who's accessing the system. But anywhere that we don't need that information, anywhere that just basic access logs and unique IPs gives us enough metrics to at least know who's using it, and there's literally no other permissions requirements on top of that, we should stop defaulting to needing people to log in at all. There's still going to be a lot of places that they need to, so we still need to solve this problem, but we can at least reduce the barriers in the places where that maybe isn't needed.
Indeed. And so we want to open the floor to questions and some targeted responses. I'm going to actually do first at bat. Can you give a few more words on what do we mean by third-party authentication, like at a grassroots level? What would that mean? And what does identity federation mean? Are those similar or are those different?
Yeah. So for the first part, third-party authentication and federation are very much in a way the same thing. They're basically the service that you've created, the thing that you want people to access, is no longer implementing authentication itself. So if you build a website, you can absolutely also build a user directory into that website, and your website's database also has usernames and password hashes in it. Anytime you shift that responsibility to a third party, you're effectively doing identity federation. That's where we're at today. We have, or at a login, we have certain NASA and other identity providers that we're using. So we're generally doing single hop identity federation across the board. And that definitely helps. It means not every service has to have its own directory, but they do have to pick which one of any number of other identity providers they're using. So what we're talking about now is making a second level hop where maybe we don't even provide the identity provider anymore. We use Facebook login, we use NASA systems, we use university systems, we use OrcID, CI login, things like that, and don't even manage our own user directory anymore. At which point the identity federation that we're talking about is what then sits in between all the services and all the possible identity providers people can use that we're no longer managing, in order to still let us manage access, who can get to what, which services require you sign a EULA first, because that is the piece that we are still responsible for, but still let us remove the responsibility of managing the individual user directories and identity providers. So we're looking for that in between two hop identity federation that allows us to still manage access, but no longer have to manage a bunch of individual identity providers.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I'm moving the mic around for a follow-up.
Mark Parsons, NASA Chief Science Data Office. I'm really naive in this, but so what you just described, is that how EduRoam works? EduRoam seems like a little bit different and it seems very clever.
EduRoam is based on the EduGain Federation, but fundamentally, yes.
EduRoam is based on the EduGain Foundation, but fundamentally, yes, says Bruce.
Yeah. I mean, there's some technicalities in terms of how EduRoam works. Yes, it's an identity federation that people have to participate in. The key question from Nathan's perspective.
So EduRoam has some technical differences, partly because it's based on the Radius protocol, which is a whole nother kettle of fish in what Nathan is talking about. But yes, it is an identity federation. A key question is, it's one that is built around research institutions. And so this works great for somebody who's at a university. Some feds can, some feds can't. My particular lab, it can work, but other DOE labs no, and Goddard no. So there's no bring your people, the institutions have to participate. And then a key question is the degree to which public identities can participate in that particular one. So there's no way to log into EduRoam with a Google credential or another social media credential. There is a minimum that meets NIST 863 Identity Assurance Level 1, that is implied in EduGain and in EduRoam specifically. The key question, and 800-63 is a useful framework. There's a lot of things for which identity assurance level 1, authenticator assurance level 1 is sufficient. There are a number of other cases. EduRoam does not, all you can assume is the base assurance. There are other places in Common and EduGain where the authentication comes back to the system and it tells the system, this is the level of identity assurance that is provided, this is the level of authentication assurance that has been provided. That's a critical piece that we have to have. So that's a specific detail where that particular example would meet some needs, but not some of the critical ones.
Yeah, as we're looking at our trusted friends and partner group, we have active investigations for how to let certain individuals who aren't fully NASA badged interact with the data more than just an anonymous person out on the internet. If they want to add or update metadata, if they want to contribute data from their own research that maybe NASA actually has a contract with this individual, but they're not fully badged and vetted through the official NASA process. So we're looking at things like that, identity verification, along with the identity that they might come across with Google or Facebook.
And in many cases, that ideally means we want to do that without forcing everybody to sign up for something new. So rather than saying, oh, you want to use our system, go sign up for this user directory, we want to be able to say, what are you already using at your university, at your institution? And as long as it speaks some language we can work with, we can connect to that. And if we need to, augment it with some other MFA token if needed, and not be limited to, again, make everybody get on board with a selected identity provider. There's a question online. Why does it matter if Fortnite knows your NASA identity? Or does it matter if systems interoperate as long as each one knows who you are? It depends on the system. In our environment, again, we're working with a lot of systems that really do need to interoperate. Fortnite's a bad example because that's not the kind of system we run. So yeah, if you are building a system that truly doesn't need to have that level of interoperating with everybody else, then it's fine to have your own view of what identity is that doesn't translate to any other system. There's still a user experience problem of, again, making everybody sign up for more and more accounts in order to use your system. If you want people to access your thing, it's a lot lower barrier to entry if they can just pick an existing credential. It's what you see on a lot of, commercial or SaaS websites. Just log in with Google or Facebook or something else. Like, you get a list of, here are the services you can use to log in with, and that does improve the user experience. For most of the services we're building, we really do want a higher level of interoperability and the ability to control access system-wide rather than one application at a time with a application-specific implementation. But yeah, if you're building a standalone service and you don't need any of that, you might not actually have any of the problems we're trying to solve.
Oh, we maybe need to take the PowerPoint out of present mode. No, that's probably. We are working to get the screen in the room showing the same thing as online.
It's still not changed to here.
Absolutely. Question from the audience.
So Madison Langseth, USGS. So how does login.gov fit into this equation?
Excellent question. And I'll let Nathan get to that once he's through with the infrastructure side. Login.gov is absolutely one of the third-party authentication providers that we are interested in, similar to Google or Facebook or CI login or any number of other potential third-party authentication services. Login.gov is absolutely one of the ones that's near the top of the list for consideration. And truthfully, we don't think it's just one, we think it's several. And so login.gov has a large field of people who already have login.gov credentials.
If you have a government ID, like my NASA.gov login, does that work then for login.gov? Is it? No. So it's not like an EduRoam for government agencies.
So Bruce Wilson, ORNL DAC. I spent a lot of time on the Department of Energy's identity management infrastructure before I came back to the ORNL DAC. Login.gov is envisioned as government to consumer, and that's its role. Max.gov is the government to government, and that's the piece where they would envision that your NASA credential would work. The interoperability is an interesting challenge. I hold the DOE credential, which should tell NASA that I have an identity assurance level of 70. I'm only 20 in the NASA system, and there are some places where my DOE PIV will work, but the whole certificate interoperability, certificate chain piece, this is a piece that I think Nathan is trying to figure out. How do we get this piece over here to deal with it so every single system doesn't have it? And one of the challenges that we've got is, yes, I can theoretically log into some of the VPNs and web proxies, but the certificate trust chain is broken someplace, and it is weird, deep, dark magic to figure out certificate trust chains.
And we're fixing those piecemeal, one at a time, right? That rat's nest of connections, every one of those is a detective effort sometimes to figure out exactly what we need to hook up to get that working.
And do you care about?
And there's thousands of them at this point.
So why login.gov versus Google? Like, does it add security, or like what does it add compared to some of these like more ubiquitous identity management things?
Yeah, so in NIST 800-6.3 is the language we speak generally. It breaks it down basically into how sure are you about the identity of the person themselves, which goes from, yeah, they at least verified a link in email, to we brought them into the office and got their fingerprints and biometrics. The how sure we are about the authenticator they used. So like multi-factor auth is better than just username and password. A physical PIV card or CAC card is even better. And then federation assurance, which is more about like what protocols do you use to talk to the thing that told you who the identity is. If that's not encrypted, you could be attacked via man in the middle. We're just talking about like identity assurance level 1. That's good enough for a lot of things. If you've got public data, totally public service, yeah, use Google, use Facebook, use other services like that. You want at least like email validation so that you're not being swarmed by bots, but you don't need much beyond that. But as soon as we get into this service lets you modify government-owned data, that's not going to fly. And the problem we're in right now is we have services that in many cases are serving both or even more. And in order to solve that today, every service that provides something to end users, but also has an admin interface, ends up having to implement those multiple different identity providers and handle that access level management itself and figure out, oh, this endpoint, I need to force them to log in again to this other system. And that's part of that explosion of how many different services have to implement how many different identity providers and vice versa.
And the other piece to add to that, so Google, my Google account is protected by multi-factor authentication, but that information is not transmitted as part of the login with Google, so that the service provider has no idea. They can only assume that I just have it protected with a password, and the person is all completely asserted attributes. So we have no, is this the Madison Langseth that is at whatever, or is this the Bruce Wilson that's at whatever? And then there is a significant cadre of people who will not use Google, who will not use Facebook, and that is particularly true among our European colleagues.
Another couple of questions from our Slido. What information do we find necessary to link a person's identity?
Yeah.
Institution age, social security number, country of origin. How do we even do that?
So you can link automatically based on user profile attributes like social security number, like driver's license number, like things like that. In general, we want to avoid having to collect that kind of data. So another way of identity linking that you'll often see on commercial websites that support like login with Facebook and Google and whatnot, it's not about having a particular attribute in a user profile that lets you say, oh, these are the same user. It's the user's ability to prove that they own both logins simultaneously. It's login with Google and then log in with Facebook. And the fact that you can do both means we know that Facebook and Google login are the same identity without needing to know anything in particular about you. We don't need your social security number. We just need you to prove that you can log in with both at the same time. And then those two are linked. And we could, in theory, do the same thing with linking your Facebook, your Google, your whatnot with your login.gov or with your NASA Launchpad in the same way without needing any of those individual identity providers to even necessarily have the same user profile attributes. It's more of an assertion of your ability, your ownership of all of these individual identities simultaneously tells us, okay, we can treat these two as the same person.
Next question in our Q&A so far, how are government agencies dealing with giving partner access? At NOAA, many systems won't let you have access unless you have a NOAA.gov email address. I know we feel that certainly on the NASA.gov email address side as well. We have some solutions, but we're still trying to figure that out. Nathan, I'm sure, can add a little bit more to that.
Yeah, not really a solution, but more this as a building block. The fact that we know a lot of our partners and users, they're not, it goes back to we can't make everybody use our thing. We know people are going to have to continue using their existing user directories and identity providers. We can at least make our stuff better at working with your stuff so that if you have to do everything else on a day-to-day basis with your NOAA account, well, maybe we can also use your NOAA account then so you don't have to sign up for 12 other accounts. We aren't in as much control of the other direction. We can't make NOAA become more interoperable with what we're building unless they want to. But we can implement this preferably using standard open source or commercial software rather than rolling our own or inventing our own protocols, which makes it easier for third parties to integrate it with it in the future. If we're building this on top of common services and protocols rather than inventing our own, that means if another agency or another university wanted to, they potentially can work with us to integrate their identity systems with ours.
I think there's something to the Identity Federation solution where perhaps you are allowing people to do the initial login with any number of different credentials that they might have, but that doesn't mean they get the whole store once they're inside. If they only have a low level of identity access through their authentication, they get some subset of permissions within the ultimate system that they're able to interact with. Should they want to interact with more administrative functions, they need to authenticate with increasing credentials up to including, there are going to be some things that are always going to be NOAA.gov. A question in the room.
And I would extend the problem spaces. I'm at a university where, you know, our IT operation is very institutionally centered, just like the government agencies, where our identity management is very inward facing and trying to do identity management and authentication, authorization for collaborative users. God forbid we'd actually work with people outside the university on things, has been a continuing challenge. And so as we're looking at trying to solve this problem, for example, our Center for Advanced Research Computing, that is by definition a platform that is used by institutional and non-institutional researchers. One of the solutions that we've been looking at is actually starting with the federated identity management even for our own institutional users, as you know, we're members of InCommon. And then along the lines of the solution you were just suggesting, if you would then have to escalate permissions beyond what you would allow with those federated users, you then have to go through an additional path to be able to do that. But it's almost a matter of sort of using the outsourced federation as the primary entry point, and then you escalate from there.
Yeah. That resonates with me a lot. In our daily lives, Nathan and I and the platform train within Earth Data Cloud that we interact with those back-end systems far more than we interact with the mission science data. And we know that from in our little corner of the world, we need that identity federation solution. We have a arm's length or shoulder's length, I don't know, connection to the mission science data where we hear the same sort of problems as we've identified, where a number of different organizations, number of different logins and complexities there. We think the identity federation solution really plays in both spaces. We're interested to hear your thoughts. So as we transition from just kind of general Q&A, we have a couple of targeted questions for the group to let us know if we're on the right track or if we really need to retune our thinking and look in totally different axes in order to solve these problems. So I'm going to attempt to show our targeted questions. I'm double mic'd. Good morning. So interested to hear from the community, what are your current pain points around data access? And we've had an open discussion about identity management and access control and third-party authentication and identity federation. All very technical, all very removed from like the human at the keyboard trying to get to science data. So I'm interested to see and hear whether or not is there overlap? Are there synergies between our the way that we're looking at this problem? All right, Windows, mouse. So this individual ORCIDs and they work well. If we have any problems, it is from the legacy system we used to use, self-hosted LDAP, linking accounts between the two systems after we migrated to ORCID. That seems like a similar space. I have to admit, I'm the low tech person in the room.
We have, God, I don't even know how many LDAP servers and databases and other Red Hat identity servers and other things we have internally that were in some ways the seeds of this problem, of realizing we had this problem. And then on our end user facing side, we started getting into, we really would like to be able to integrate with Facebook and Login and other services, login.gov, OrcID, and realizing I think that's actually the same problem, or it's at least the same problem space, and we may actually be able to introduce tooling that helps us solve both those problems instead of only solving the customer, or in our case, citizen identity management, or only the organizational or internal identity management, because there is so much overlap in what's needed in those problem spaces.
We have a comment that password managers are helping a lot. So just a local solution in order to get around the authentication complexity.
I had a question previously that ties into that one. As I'm thinking through initially it was the screen of like, how do you want to log in? And I can just picture like 76 buttons listed.
Exactly.
And myself likely having, 30% of those buttons, I have accounts with those buttons, And so as I deal with, the application side and the user side, I'm curious if you guys have thought through how to display to a user that application, it's like the access control. It's like, so if you were to use this account, you'd be able to use these applications and accomplish these things. If you use this one, you have this. And then a year down the road saying, oh, there's a new application, and the one that you've been using for the last 2 years is great, but you need to use this one now because it offers some additional authentication. Something you've thought through or something I'm overthinking?
It's not something you're overthinking, and I think it's not in front of the speaker. Twofold answer. One is in the how do we improve the user experience of you logged in with one thing and now you tried to do a thing that's not a high enough assurance level. How do we make that experience good, right? At some point, if you logged in with something that's, identity assurance level 1 and you try to perform an admin function, we're going to have to kick you back and tell you, okay, you need to enter a MFA token now or something else. So making that user experience work, make it really clear what happened when you get kicked back to another system. So you're not just like, why the hell am I seeing an RSA logo now? Is one part of it. The other part of it is we obviously don't want to have, you try to log into something and you get a suite of 1,000 options and you have no idea which option is actually going to get you what you need. There's a trade-off here in introducing tooling that lets us integrate with just literally any identity provider in the universe. We don't necessarily want to be offering a list of literally every identity provider in the universe just because of the confusion that creates in the users. So there is going to be some selection of, based on how popular is this, how many users have this, or do we support a user community that is all in OrcID or all in this, that would be driving why we want to integrate with one identity provider or another, because just having a suite of 1,000 of them ceases to be helpful. And then getting into that, how do you know which one you should log in with? Figuring out how to have the service that's having you log in know you're trying to perform a function that needs assurance level 2. Let's show the shorter list, or have a good user experience of kicking you back through a workflow to say, hey, we need you to upgrade your identity effectively.
That's important, but I think we shouldn't discount the value to the service provider of these different identity providers as well, as that's been part of our discussion about our the implementation of this new identity management and access system for our high performance computing center, in that ORCID is emerging as probably the strongly preferred authentication method, because then we can link ORCIDs to the activities on that system, which then provides us a huge amount of additional related publicly accessible information about the users, where we can then more effectively tell impact stories about the use of this research platform to continue to justify its support and funding and use.
Yeah, and that justify funding is one of the big reasons we do have login in front of practically everything right now, even if there aren't access restrictions. Show who's using your data, because then you can justify why you're getting paid to still host it. But to your point, yeah, that's a really good example of a case where, yeah, you could offer all of the identity providers in the universe, but maybe you actually don't want to because you have specific reasons for OrcID versus random public service where, yeah, that's fine, you can log in with Google, we just need to know you're not a bot.
Plus there's the reluctance or issues with what information is shared with those identity providers that people may not want to share.
And that goes both ways. That's why there are some people who won't use a login with Google, and I won't use a login with Facebook, period, full stop. But to the point that was raised earlier, it's also important, and Nathan hasn't gotten into answers because he's talking about what's the questions. But we are far from the first people to have this problem. And there are a variety of solutions. I actually implemented some of the stuff that you were talking about a minute ago, 7 years ago, that would take a look at, okay, you're trying to log into this system, kicking somebody back to an identity provider because the provided level of assurance wasn't there. The particular technology I used at that point in time, I would not recommend at this point in time because the world keeps changing. And that's, again, the other thing, which is how do you design this system so that, when the company that you're using gets acquired by Facebook and you decide that's not where you really want to go, that we haven't painted ourselves completely into a corner.
I want to pivot to this question: access to data, or current pain point. Access to data from scripts and programs, both from short token lifetimes and timeouts, and needing to manage secrets. A pain point for end users trying to access data either as themselves or through machine users. How does that intersect with third-party authentication or identity federation, or our assumption of some data potentially allowing anonymous access? Is there an intersection there in your mind?
I think there's different ways to authenticate based on whether you're a user going to a website through a browser, whether you're a user but you're at a Jupyter notebook or writing a Python script, versus you're a long-lived server that you need to install a certificate on and then not have to think about it again. We do a poor job of differentiating between those today and figuring out what is the right way to approach this for servers. So we tend to have solutions that involve you putting your personal username and password in your Circle CI builds to get the tests to pass. And then if that username and password expires every 60 days, we end up with workarounds rather than actually having better solutions for machine access or user-based but script-based access. And that's another place where we're looking into tools. In evaluating the tools that can do this identity federation, it's also looking into making sure they do support a variety of different mechanisms for machine authentication too, because we don't want you to have to tell Bamboo to pretend to be you or tell GitHub Actions to pretend to be you in order to get your build to run. That's dumb. It should be able to log in as the server that it is, potentially with some ownership information so that we can establish what permissions it has. But your system components should not need to pretend to be users in order to access things. That again gets back into, we don't want to solve this by having every service provider have to support a particular human-based authentication method and certificates and API tokens. We want to be able to centralize that aspect of it. So the service provider in question doesn't care whether you signed in with a cert or an API key or whatever else. It can just implement one mechanism for figuring out what is the identity that's talking to me. But the user has a lot of options in terms of how they're connecting to it, whether those are user in a browser-based options or more machine-based options. Obviously, introducing a tool like that doesn't solve the problem up front, but it gives us a lot more tools and options with how we can do that.
I guess that raises a question for me, because the identity providers that we've been talking about so far, in my experience, have typically been human-centered in terms of, I'm Carl, Bruce is Bruce. But, the way we've addressed that in our systems that we manage behind the scenes, we have our individual user accounts, and we typically have service accounts that we create that relate to, that do a lot of that machine-to-machine authentication and provide a bit of a firewall between individual users and these system level interactions. Are there, or is this a need for actually establishing essentially identity management services that are more service-based instead of individual human-based as an additional identity provider that we could possibly tap into to enable some of these interactions? Because the dynamics of these interactions are very different from me logging into a system at a time scale and frequency that is mitigated by my need to eat and sleep and have a life, compared to my servers that we hope never do any of those things.
There's a talk tomorrow about that, I think.
Plug for the AIML talk happening tomorrow.
There's a ChatGPT talk tomorrow.
Yeah. In my opinion, yes, those things really are different use cases, and we're hurting in a lot of places, I believe, by having the same identity providers, or not necessarily the same identity providers, but the same identity workflows, the same login mechanisms for human beings as for systems. Because then you add password rotation or password complexity requirements or other things that make total sense for an interactive user who's logging in, but breaks everybody's builds and service to service interactions because we're using the same login workflows and mechanisms for two very different things. In the NASA world on the Launchpad side, we fortunately do have a separate mechanism for creating service accounts with certificates that are still linked to people so you know who owns the service in question, but it does give you a way of separating a user who needs to log in with a NASA badge at some point to set the thing up from a certificate that is specifically for a service or server, and it has to be renewed like once every year or two or something. But it really is important to be able to separate those workflows. It doesn't necessarily mean two different identity providers, because an identity provider can support more than one login workflow, more than one type of credential, but they really are very different workflows that have very different kinds of life cycles in terms of what do you use to authenticate, or what does a person use to authenticate versus what does a server in your basement that you're going to hopefully not touch that often need to
I guess my question would be, are there currently any identifiers or service providers that provide that sort of dual workflow approach? I primarily see them as an individual user workflow type of system.
The only ones I'm aware of are internal ones right now. I don't know of anything like Google, Facebook, whatever else that do actually provide, like, they'll provide ways for you to log in from your script rather than necessarily from a user in a browser sometimes, but it's still a user logging in rather than creating separate service accounts. A lot of the tools we've started evaluating do have the ability to set up on their own additional credentials. So you establish an identity with Google or Facebook or login.gov or whatever else. And once you're logged into the Federation service could give you an API key or a certificate or something else that is also linked to that identity. Again, it's a starting point. It doesn't give us a solution, but it gives us some tools and options to play with to hopefully help with that.
What is the separation, like the developer doc, right? It's like,
In any world that I've used that has both, it's always like the normal user login. But then there's like this whole separate ecosystem that is developers. And so they definitely exist. And I think that we have long tried to just make them the same thing because we started with the users. We don't really have any idea how to build this whole developer ecosystem or really the necessity to do so. And so it's just like, let's just make it all one thing. And I don't know as though we'll get to the whole developer ecosystem where you've got like these dev teams and a whole separate documentation, a whole separate website. Like that seems a little extreme, which makes it more complicated.
Yeah, I like where we're headed, and thank you everybody for the pain points. It helps shape our understanding of the problem space and helps make Nathan and I realize that we're not totally crazy. We have friends out there. I appreciate that. Our next question is, what are some of the solutions to these problems, right? It's easy enough to cry and whine about the state of the world, but what do we feel like we can do about it? So if you have ideas for solutions in this area, please feel free to add them to the Slido and we'll have a conversation about it. And while you are thinking about that, hearing about all the nuances of the pain points and the different identity providers and scenarios that we run into, it occurs to me from a management standpoint, to Ryan's point, we started with the end users and we developed a solution for the end users, but then things changed. Things changed and grew, and we tried to add some sense of security and authentication around our developer community. And then both of those grew. It's like watching a tree graph multiply. And we lost the ability to keep up as we tried to develop internally solutions for identity management, authentication, authorization. We got into this space where we had a solution that was really tuned to one use case and then applied to as many use cases as we could, but in suboptimal ways. And so it feels like it's that trying to build this ourselves or trying to develop point solutions as we have over the last many years isn't really keeping up with the problem. And so part of what we've identified is probably time to be considering external commercial industry solutions for identity management for this space, looking at organizations who this is all they do, and they do it really well, like Okta, like ForgeRock, getting above kind of the little individual piece part modules that we build up with LDAP servers and Postgres databases and SAML connections, but actually going pro, which as an infrastructure guy, I'm really excited about. We feel like that's the right direction, or that's the level of solution that is needed, but I'm very interested to hear from the audience if they have other experience of things that worked, things that we should also be thinking about in this solution space. Checking the Zoom chat. The answer.
They posted the solution in chat an hour ago. Why didn't we just read that?
I know, my goodness. Obviously, it's a simple problem. You dummies. Why aren't you just doing this?
So as I just stated, the developer thing, which was really just kind of a random thought. I've been on this contract for part of the NASA thing. My name's Ryan Abbott. I work for, I'm the architect similar to Nathan, but on the search and discovery train within ED. I've been here for 7.5 years. I've worked on every tool that I can think of on that contract. And I think this week I've been to 4 or 5 ESIPs. This is the week where I think I've realized that my understanding, which I thought was clear, has been wrong the entire time of who and how and what we should be targeting from a user perspective. And as I think through this and the challenges of like presenting 15 buttons and understanding these things, should we be separating our tools, our DNS and our documentation and our authentication more clearly? Because, as 3 years ago, we rewrote Earth Data Search and we made some tweaks, did some things that we thought were better. We got a new UIX person that helped us have some user interviews. It's still not great for people who don't know what they're doing. It's actually quite bad. And I wonder, like, as someone who wants the machine-to-machine work, because we have background jobs that run, we have scripts that are super important, we have DACs that are constantly yelling at us about interaction with a CMR. Does the developer kind of backend help alleviate some of the confusion around how and what is necessary for all these things, including the ACLs and the way that we're managing our data? And the front end it's Twitter. It's like the easiest thing you can do, but you don't have to even know that the rest of the crap exists. But I feel like we're making it more difficult by attempting to present everything that is this massive spectrum in like one pathway. And so maybe it makes sense that we start to separate some of these things and not even present some of these issues where we don't need to.
Kind of a divide and conquer specialization approach for this. I'm trying to see if I understand what you're saying. For this class of user, just focus on their experience independent of trying to boil the ocean with everybody else's, and then you end up with suboptimal solutions around. Is that kind of where you're headed?
I feel like we have two right now in terms of we have front ends that are UIs, like our data search. And then we have backend APIs like CMR that back those things. There's this whole field of users in between that are they're writing scripts, they're writing code in Jupyter notebooks or elsewhere to get at data, but not necessarily writing production applications that are going to run on a server long-term. And we tend to be, if we were creating an API, we're probably creating it more for other application developers building production systems than we are for a person who just wants to be able to curl an endpoint and pipe it to Python scripts that they got from their advisor. That feels like a place where we're not really serving very well, that maybe there are more categories here than just developers and UIs that are really that kind of in between space of how do we make APIs that are actually designed to be directly used by end users as opposed to APIs that are designed to be used by people building another application that's going to be used by end users.
Yeah, your comment really resonates with me as in my former role in a geospatial application center, we had an epiphany about a year after Google released their Maps API back in the mid-aughts. As we had been developing interactive online mapping applications since the late 90s and building them like GIS experts, which we were, and weren't getting a lot of use or uptake. And finally realizing with seeing the explosion of the use and interaction of users of the stripped down Maps interface, that for addressing our user needs, we did have to strip the thing down to bare metal and add only the features in that were needed to meet the needs of the users that we were addressing, and started to think more about progressive access, where you have the surface that's that stripped down simple interface that is really oriented to the entering novice user who doesn't have all of that background knowledge, but you have points of entry for the users who want to take advantage of the data services as opposed to just downloading a nice soil moisture data set or some other sort of simple data need that they have, and they don't have a more sophisticated understanding or requirement. Those that do have the more complex requirements hopefully have the interest and enough additional knowledge to be able to look for those points of entry, go through them, and then interact with those more complex features and capabilities, and potentially the additional authentication requirements that are associated with those. But you don't put those on the surface. You have a nice, clean, simple point of entry, and then you have some doors at the back of each of those rooms that you can go deeper into the labyrinth if you need to. But you're not forced to go all the way through and meet the Minotaur at the very beginning.
So that's maybe where our applications and our the way that we've historically developed our applications are actually making this more difficult for you guys. And we could make some adjustments to the way that we write our applications in the form of adjustments, because they're already all written, to kind of alleviate some of the stress associated with how do we present these login pages. So it may just be a case that we've been going about this all wrong altogether, not just from an authentication perspective. Because from Earth Data Search and from CMR, all these other things, the level of authentication you need is relatively low. You're just downloading public data. And so, but we have one entry point, one interface for all of it. And so now we have presented ourselves with these new issues that we might be able to just remove if we make some small changes. We should talk to somebody about that. I don't know who that is, though.
I think one of the potentially small changes, potentially somewhat broad change, is the renewed interest in really just anonymous access. Right now, in front of the NASA Earth Science data is Earth Data Login, which is easy to get an account with. It's very minimal level of entry, but still from a technical side, it adds complexity to the interaction between those applications. For certain classes of data, really anonymous access may be fine and help get us to that Twitter level, or that really lowest barrier to entry, developing applications or developing on-ramps or training materials for those new members of the science community who don't know how to interact with CMR, who don't know the lingo, but are interested and want to become a part of the community. Really invest in our anonymous access data. I think there's something to that. I know Susan gave a talk yesterday about a research study that she and NASA did with a number of data science interested organizations around the country for environmental protection services, local, regional interested groups, and who weren't already associated with NASA data, didn't understand Earth Data Search, CMR, Earth Data Login, and didn't necessarily have a data scientist on staff, who were all interested in using science data to inform their organization's work. And they all said, this is too hard. Where's the easy button? Where's the easy on-ramp method? So I think there's a lot to what you're saying. How do we make dead simple user interface in order to kind of rope them in? I like it. Other suggestions here in our Slido, having a collection, EduGain, ORCID, Login.gov, modest number of social identities probably gets us most of the way there as far as need. I think we're talking here about third-party authentication, but that we need to be cautious about non-US folks. Yeah, I was hoping somebody would bring up, there's a lot of United States-centric options here, certainly the commercial options. How do we interact with our international science community? EduGain is international, okay. Login.gov, agreed. I think that's a major player in our solution space. And then this one's interesting. Rephrasing the question or the approach. Deferring to a zero trust architecture, allowing each data provider to manage their own verification service and forcing each pipe to use those endpoints.
That sort of makes sense as long as all of those interactions are one service to one other service. As soon as their one service needs to talk to 10 things and those talk 10 different languages, that's effectively what we're having to do today. And we're seeing more and more of our development time being spent on exactly that, having each pipe, building each pipe to have to support 10 different potential other services it's needing to work with. So that's where being able to centralize some of that and have a translation layer can help reduce the level of effort that's required. Can still give you effectively that zero trust approach where a system uses the language of identity that it knows to authenticate, but the system it wants to talk to doesn't have to speak the same language, and as a result have to speak 10 different languages in order to interact with the suite of other services that it needs to talk to.
I think there is, I'm assuming this was a question on the acronym CMR, the NASA Earth Science Common Metadata Repository, where individuals are able to search and find the data sets that they're looking for, unless this was a suggestion of a potential solution to our identity management problem, which honestly would be interesting. You don't want to take this on, right? Any other thoughts about solutions that we might be considering, or out of the box directions? I also have a general question of, are we even looking at the problem correctly? Is this a problem that needs to be solved. I'm hearing lots of positive sentiment in the room, although I think we probably have a little bit of a bias for people who were willing to attend an identity management talk at 8 a.m. probably are a little bit invested in it.
I don't think you're looking at it wrong, and I'm incredibly naive on this topic, but it seems to me that we need to be more clearly separating the social aspects and the technical aspects. And I think that's part of what is the defaulting to the zero trust architecture. So I know that the other repositories outside of Earth Science in NASA are very reluctant to implement authentication. Not all of them, but many of them are like, so, and, Earth Science has gone down this path. There was resistance at the beginning, planetary and astrophysics, they don't want to go down this path. And I think because it begins to open up some of these questions.
Yeah.
So I think, and you had it as your last point, or you had it as your last point in the thing of, what do we actually really need to be authenticating for? So, and I think asking that fundamental question, and then the other social aspect seems that, I think it's absolutely insane that Bruce is a 20 in NASA and a 70 in DOE.
Right.
Why aren't the freaking federal agencies collaborating on this? Small challenge. But I think that also gets to, I think that's Bruce's point, the collection of EduGain, ORCID, and login.gov. That seems like where we should default and build from that. So I just think we have two very distinct problems. The social problem, which would, if we addressed, more collaboration, if federal agencies could join EduGain, that would go a long ways to a lot of issues. So that's just, thinking about the social problems as much as the technical.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Again, let me respond to a point that, because there's a piece of this which is way above their pay grade, and which is being actively debated at the DAC manager and ESDIS level. So there's an interesting story here, because it had been asserted since I came into ESDIS in 2006 that there was an Office of Management of Budget directive that required us to implement Earth Data Login and to be able to track who had downloaded which NASA pieces of data. As a consequence of some of the challenges that we've discussed here, we actually asked the question and said, okay, show me the memo. Nobody can prove it. And we've gone back to asking. And so I think there are some things there where OMB asked some questions that were interpreted as directions. And so part of what you're asking is a question which is being debated at the ESDIS and ESDS level to say, well, do we actually have to force people to authenticate and provide an identity in order to be able to download completely unrestricted NASA data?
Right.
And I'd say that that's a question which is very actively under debate. And I have some sense that I think the answer is leaning in the direction that many of us want, which is eliminate login for the vast majority of the data and focus not on the identities of the users, which we frankly don't use that often. The main place that the ORNL DAC uses who downloaded this data is if we subsequently find a mistake in the data, we will proactively notify the people who have downloaded that data to say, hey, wait a minute, the JEDI level 4 data that you downloaded, it's actually got a problem in it. Here's where the updated data is. That's a valid reason for maintaining identities. But that's an exception, and are we willing to give up some of those things? And Bruce Wilson's personal answer is, I hope that answer is going to be yes. And I am mildly optimistic that we're going to get the yes that we want on those questions. And that simplifies their problem a lot.
Indeed, indeed. That's an interesting use case for, hey, you need to notify individuals that a data set's changed. I hadn't even considered that.
Or you need to let them know that their script is stuck in an infinite loop, downloading the same granule 1,000 times a second.
Similar sort of color to the debate that comes down to our level with the metrics and tracking of overall usage of the data that's then tried to be tied back to individuals' identities or scientific discipline associations and whatnot. And how can we do this metricing if we don't have the identities of the individuals? And I think there's an interesting conversation happening of, is that actually the metricing that we need? Can we still gather the data use intelligence that we want in order to make strategic decisions without even knowing who the people are, just through anonymous access?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, because as I've now lived in the library world for the last 9 years, coming out of sort of application development for data discovery, access, and use, the anonymity of users has increased by orders of magnitude in my sensitivity, being the folks that I hang out with, as that's a core value and principle for libraries. But as I manage our IT systems for the library, and as one of the things, we also see value in being able to link user identities or at least user identifiers with interactions on the system as a potential way to provide value-added services. So that you can provide some of those capabilities that folks are accustomed to in other systems, where it's like, here is your history, here are things related to what you've looked at before. And so anonymity, anonymous access is really useful, but having an option for non-anonymous access to be able to provide value-added services linked to the identity information provided by users is one important consideration, but also being able to take into account the growing use of systems like Apple's Hide My Email, where you can create individual email identifiers, which are commonly used as the point of contact, to obfuscate or at least reduce the opportunities for linking your identity across systems. And I think that's going to be an increasing pattern from users who are privacy focused. And how do we integrate that into our thinking about what do we mean by identity, what information needs to be included in identity, or what are the services and values provided by that identity?
I agree that your point about Hide My Email, I'm not aware of that service, but I think is very on point. The metrics that we collect today through Earth Data Login user profiles, I think are very suspect, because there is no barrier to entry. There is no vetting of, hey, yes, you actually do work with that university or are interested in X versus Y. There was a drop-down selection for what sort of science are you interested in.
Other.
And I selected clouds because cloud computing, but I know that's not what they meant. So I'm being added to the group of people who are interested in cloud coverage.
See Fred Flintstone at example.com,
There you go. Right. So we built this system to collect those metrics and associate them with users, but it's fishy.
Something you just said, actually, a lot of the tools we've been looking at have been specifically in the customer identity and access management field, because that maps most closely to what is, in effect, for us, citizen access management. That means they come with a lot of features that are really designed for, you have a store and you're selling a product. One feature in particular that a lot of them have is that idea of progressive authentication or progressive identity, because you don't want to force somebody to, if you're running a website that sells products, you don't want people to have to log in order to see that you have a sale, but you do want to kind of progressively figure out who they are as you get them through your sales pipeline.
Yeah.
I had initially thought that kind of feature is not useful to us at all, but what you just described about in terms of like, yes, they should be able to get in as anonymous, but then maybe some level of identity is actually needed for us to be able to get them some more value-added services. I'm starting to think actually that could be really useful in terms of, yeah, they get the data anonymously. If they have questions, then we upgrade their identity a level. If they want to sign up for a developer account, we upgrade their identity further. So maybe there really are use cases for that kind of progressive authentication.
And we're coming right to our 9:30. We'll do Ryan and then Mark, and I think we'll call it a morning.
So this is, I enjoy coming to this because this is like I'll call it a localized issue, right? It's a big problem, but it's like talking about one topic. And it's interesting because from my perspective on search and discovery, that's the kind of information that like big companies utilize. And you can imagine in like this perfect world, that information is anonymized and, you know, separated and wonderful and used for only the best things ever. And of course, like that's always our goal when we're sitting in government agencies and trying to help scientists. I can't speak for everybody, but like the more information that I have, the easier and better experience I can provide searching and discovering the data that we have. People keep throwing, oh, you need some AI and ML. It's okay, that's all fine and dandy. And I can give you really interesting stuff on the data, but without any context of the person and their field of study and their background, I can't do a whole lot. If you want to search for, you know, sea surface temperatures, I can give you a whole bunch of information, but knowing even anything about you and your background will provide a much better experience. And so you guys are talking about a large problem trying to get it down. Like from search and discovery, I'm being asked to house, you know, billions of records and yet provide 20 search results to someone that's relevant and getting complaints when I can't do that, but I don't have any information to help whittle that down. And so we have a similar problem just searching our data because we don't have the information. But I also support, I mean, I love the Apple Hide My Email. I use it every single time. I don't want my information out there, but boy, would it be awesome when I go someplace to have the information. I just don't trust people to do it. And so it's this really interesting, like mind melding world that we live in. It's always going to be difficult.
I like it. I think, Mark, did you have a last comment?
Oh, I was just going to say that Susan's study reinforced what Carl said. She made the point that, you know, they get to the point where they get to have to download the data and they freak out because they don't know what they're actually getting. So that your analog of, you know, you want to show them as much as you can. And then actually 20 years ago, I was managing a data collection that was embargoed for a period, and so people had to register to get to it, and they had to say why they wanted it, and then eventually the embargo ended, but we left the registration there as optional, and it was surprising how many people opted in, but opting in is much friendlier than opting out.
Yeah. Well, we are 2 over. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining our session. Enjoy your e-sipping.